Good evening, everyone. The Town of Los Gatos Planning Commission meeting of Wednesday, September 13, 2023 is now called to order. And we ask that you please take a moment to silence your devices if you haven't already done that. And we'll begin with the roll call. Commissioner Janoff.
Here.
Commissioner Hanson.
Here.
Commissioner Thomas.
Here.
Commissioner Burnett.
Here.
And I am here. Thank you very much. So we'll move next to the Pledge of Allegiance, and Commissioner Janoff's leading tonight.
Flag of the United States of America, the Republic for which it stands, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. And I'm going to make a few preliminary remarks which are indicated in the Town of Los Gatos Council's policy manual. In tonight's meeting, any person desiring to speak will need to go to the microphone. All participants in the room must speak into the microphone or when called on in Zoom. No person other than commissioners, staff, and the person having the floor is permitted to enter into the discussion. No person is allowed to speak a second time on the same item. And to assure the opportunity of all to speak, there's no yielding of time to another speaker. As the Planning Commission conducts the meeting this evening, we encourage active participation by the public, which is essential to our democracy and to the important work of the Planning Commission. Public input is always very much welcomed, and comments on the agenda items are carefully considered. Your participation can occur in two ways. First, written communications can be submitted to the staff for submission to the Planning Commission for distribution to the Planning Commission in advance of the meeting. And during the meeting, there are two opportunities for members of the public to speak. The first is during verbal communications, where a person may speak on any item that is not on our agenda for tonight. And during the hearing on the two agenda items 2 and 3 for tonight, individuals may speak on those items. And we ask that members of the public who wish to speak turn in a speaker card if they haven't done so already. And when you speak, please come to the microphone as the meeting is being recorded. So in fairness to all, the time for public comment on either of those opportunities is 3 minutes. So we now come to verbal communications, and members of the public are invited to address the Commission on any matter not on the agenda for tonight's meeting. And staff will announce when your 3-minute time limit is up if we have any speakers. And do we have anyone? Sorry? Mr. Paulson, do we have anyone on Zoom who wishes to speak on verbal communications?
Thank you, Chair. I do not see any hands raised for items not on the agenda.
Thank you. And staff, are any cards turned in?
No, we don't have any cards, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we'll move on to the consent calendar. We have one item on the consent calendar tonight, which is approval of the minutes of our August 26, 2023 meeting. And before the Planning Commission acts on the consent calendar, any member of the Commission may request the item to be removed. Are there any such requests? Do not see any. So we'll now move on to the approval of the minutes of our last meeting. And do any of the commissioners have proposed amendments to the minutes? And Ms. Armour, you were going to help out on this.
Yes, thank you. I did want to clarify that we made one edit to the meeting minutes just to correct the titles for the chair and vice chair.
Thank you. And so is there a motion to approve the minutes? Commissioner Hanson?
I move that we approve the consent calendar, which consists of the minutes of our August 23rd meeting. 26th.
23rd. And a second? Commissioner Thomas had your hand up. Thank you. Any discussion? If not, I'll call the question and ask commissioners to raise their hand if they approve the minutes and the motion. Okay, that's unanimous. So now we'll move on to the public hearings portion of our meeting, beginning with item 2. On this item, we are asked to forward recommendations to the town council on the following 4 topics. Amend the general plan to modify the land use designation of 16492 Los Gatos Boulevard and APN 532078086 from low density residential to neighborhood commercial. Second, to amend the general plan to modify the designation of the Caltrans right-of-way from low-density residential to medium-density residential. And third, a zone change for the Caltrans right-of-way adjacent to 14685 Oka Road from R18 to RM1422. And finally, application of the housing element overlay zone to the sites included in the sites inventory of the 2031 housing element. Per staff, an environmental impact report was prepared and certified for the 2024 general plan update on June 30th of last year, which included the proposed general plan amendments, and so per staff, no further environmental analysis is required. The amendment application is Z23003, and general plan amendment application is GP 23003. The applicant is the town of Los Gatos, and the specific parcels affected are identified on page 17 of the staff report. Is there a staff report, Ms. Schutman?
There is. Thank you and good evening. Tonight's item is a continuation from the August 23rd Planning Commission meeting. The 6th cycle housing element does include implementation programs that involve amendments to the general plan and rezoning of parcels within the town to allow for modified development standards to provide the development capacity required by state law and the town's regional housing needs allocation. In summary, the Commission will be providing a recommendation to the Council on the following general plan amendments and zone changes. The first being an amendment to the general plan to modify land use designation of 16492 Los Gatos Boulevard and the adjacent vacant parcel at APN 532-07-086 from low density residential to neighborhood commercial, followed by an amendment to the general plan to modify the designation of the Caltrans right-of-way from low density residential to medium density residential, as well as a zone change from R18 to RM512. And lastly is the application of the housing element overlay zone to only the sites included in the sites inventory of the housing element. Lastly, it was brought to staff's attention that the density specified in Table 1A of Attachment 9 for the North 40 specific plan should state the minimum and maximum density range as described in the housing element. This edit will be incorporated with the future staff report to the Town Council. This completes staff's presentation, but we are available for any questions.
Thank you very much. And are there questions? Commissioner Thomas.
I just have a disclosure that I live within the 1,000 feet of some of these parcels, and so I will be recusing myself.
Okay, understood. And you'll wait patiently outside chambers. Okay, we can now proceed. So there were no questions of staff at this time, correct? Okay. And I guess we don't have any speakers, so we'll close the public portion of the public hearing on item 2.
Excuse me, Chair. Let's check on Zoom to make sure that we don't have anyone who wishes to speak, and invite in case anybody in the audience would like to fill out a speaker card.
Thanks for that reminder.
Thank you, Chair. So I do not see any hands raised for item number 2.
All right, so we will now close the public portion of the public hearing on item 2 and ask if commissioners have any questions for staff, wish to comment on the proposed recommendations, or introduce a motion regarding the recommendations for consideration by the council. Commissioner Hanson.
Because this item was continued from the last meeting, I thought it was important to make a couple of comments about this. The intent of all of these amendments and the zoning change are to basically make our housing element possible, in that the zoning and the land use densities are not high enough for us to meet our RENA. And so we had seen at the last meeting where we had approved the housing element overlay zone. And what we're doing is we're applying the housing element overlay zone to only these specific sites that were in the approved site inventory. And there are a couple of sites that, as mentioned by staff, that have to be adjusted to be able to apply the housing element overlay zone. So that's what we're doing here. And it's the second part of what we were doing in the last meeting, which was establishing the housing overlay zone for the site inventory. And Commissioner Janoff and I are both on the General Plan Committee and the Housing Element Advisory Board, as well as Commissioner Thomas. So we've seen this before. So that's why we didn't have any additional questions.
Thank you. Other questions or comments?
Through the chair, I believe the town attorney had a recommendation once the committee gets close to a motion.
Thank you.
Yes, for this item, and actually for the next item as well, the staff recommendation is so lengthy that rather than reading the staff recommendation into the record, it would be fine for the maker of a motion to say that they're moving for approval of the staff recommendation together with the findings that are set out in the agenda packet.
Thank you for that. I had one question. Can you describe the how the referendum that's passed interplays with the motion that we're about to make?
Sure. So while the 2040 general plan land use element did have increased densities, the implementation as part of the housing element is proposing to take those densities, but in a more focused way. So instead of townwide, those increased densities are only being looked at for these specific sites only. So it's a much more focused way to get to the town's RENA.
Great, thank you. I didn't see any further comments, so we're ready for a motion. Commissioner Hanson.
I move that we recommend the 4 general plan amendment and zoning changes as noted in the staff report on page 17. And we're forwarding this recommendation to our town council. And I can make the findings that no further environmental analysis is required. I can make the required finding that the general plan amendments are internally consistent with the existing goals and policies of the general plan and its elements, in that the amendments will provide for the development of housing for the sites in the site inventory to comply with the town's RENA. I can further make the required finding that the proposed zone changes are consistent with the general plan and its elements, and that the proposed zonings are consistent with the proposed general plan and land use designations. And so we're going to forward the recommendation of approval for the general plan amendments and zone change application to town council. Do I need to add anything about the item that you mentioned with the minimum and max density in the table?
You could include that as part of your motion if you would like.
Since it wasn't noted as such in the staff report, we'll include staff's adjustment in the motion.
Thank you for the motion. Is there a second? Commissioner Janoff?
Second the motion.
Any discussion? If not, I'll call the question. Raise hands if you're in favor of the motion. That passes unanimously. And I assume there are no appeal rights since it's a recommendation, correct?
That is correct. There are no appeal rights, and now we will have Commissioner Thomas rejoin us.
Okay, so we'll now move on to item 3 on the agenda, which concerns accessory dwelling units. We're again asked by staff to forward a recommendation to the town council on amendments to chapter 29 zoning regulations of the town code regarding accessory dwelling units. And the proposed amendments also correct outdated references to sections of the town code included in sections pertaining to termination of non-conforming use status requirements for 2-unit developments under SB 9 and civil penalties. Per staff, the environmental impacts of the proposed amendment were analyzed in the environmental impact report of the 2024 general plan, and additionally the proposed amendments are exempt pursuant to CEQA section 15061B3. This is Town Code Amendment Application A23002. Project location is townwide, and the applicant is Town of Los Gatos. Are there any disclosures on this item? If not, Mr. Mullen, you're going to.
Okay,
I invite you to make your staff presentation.
Thank you and good evening. In response to changes in state law, the town has updated the town code regarding ADUs in 2017 and 2020. New housing legislation continues to be signed into law, impacting ADUs on almost an annual basis. The latest bills impacting ADUs, SB 897 and AB 2221, were signed into law and took effect on January 1st of this year. With the latest changes at the state level, staff identified that the current ADU ordinance requires updating once again. In addition to current state law, staff evaluated feedback and technical assistance from HCD regarding aspects of the town's current ordinance and direct input from residents of the town regarding the impacts of neighboring ADUs after construction. Staff determined that an overhaul of the current ordinance is necessary to align with state law, respond to HCD guidance, and address privacy impacts of new ADUs. Excuse me. The draft ordinance that's being considered tonight carries forward much of the current ordinance language while introducing new content required by the state. The draft ordinance is reorganized into a framework that provides details on definitions, regulations, process, and fees. Your staff report discusses each of the draft ADU code sections and provides an assessment of the existing regulations and how and why they are modified under the draft ordinance. Overall, the draft ordinance provides a comprehensive framework for ADU regulation that complies with state law, incorporates feedback from HCD, and introduces design standards to help reduce privacy impacts resulting from ADU construction. Included with the draft ordinance are 3 additional town code sections outside of the ADU ordinance that require minor revisions to update cross-references to the ADU sections that would change with the draft ordinance. An addendum has been distributed correcting table 1.1-2 in the draft ordinance, and staff recommends that these changes be incorporated to any motion to recommend approval to the town council. Excuse me. In conclusion, staff recommends that the Planning Commission review the draft ordinance and forward a recommendation of approval to the town council. And this concludes staff's presentation, and we are available to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Millen, and I'll turn to my commissioners and see if they have any questions. Commissioner Hanson.
I just wanted to ask the question for the benefit of the public, because I believe this to be the case. These changes in the ADU ordinance are required for us to have a certifiable housing element, or they have to be done, for the state to consider.
Yeah, the town's ordinance needs to comport with state law, and in the absence of an amendment, the state law would apply anyway, and so it makes sense to have the two be consistent.
And I can add that while this is one of the implementation programs in the housing element, it isn't one of the rezonings that's required to be done prior to the January 31st, 2024 deadline.
Thank you for that clarification. I just wanted to make sure since we had the meeting last night, there was a lot of people that were concerned about the deadlines. And so the last item, I did not mention this, but Ms. Armour just did, that the last item was the required zoning changes that we need to comply with the January 31st, 2024 deadline so that we don't have an issue with state control. So the only remaining step, as I understand it, this is a question, is for the town council to approve those zoning changes.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions at this time? I guess you've probably already answered this question, but can you state that the amendments that we're asked to recommend to the council are all, in effect, required to comply with state law?
Thank you for that question. I would characterize that most of the changes that staff has recommended are required to comply with state law. Staff has introduced some design standards that are not required by state law that would address some of the feedback that we've received from residents as ADUs have been built next door. Typically, the feedback is related to second-story ADUs and the privacy impacts from windows and decks. And an additional change that's outlined in the staff report relating to lot coverage and exempting ADUs from lot coverage, which is not required by state law, but would further, it would help remove barriers to creation of ADUs, which is aligns with the housing element.
Thanks so much. And Commissioner Janoff.
Thank you. A follow-up question with regard to the design standards being invoked. First question is, are these objective design standards?
Thank you for that question and that clarification. They are objective design standards. And if you took a close look at them next to the SB 9 ordinance that was adopted last year, they're very similar to some of the design standards that are included there.
So just to follow up, and even though an application to build an ADU is a ministerial process, the objective design standards would still apply?
Yes.
Other questions at this time? Commissioner Henson.
I just wanted to clarify that, like the SB 9 ordinance, we are allowed to do that even though it's not in the state law. We're allowed to have some design standards that we have the latitude to do that.
That is correct, and as long as they are objective design standards.
Got it. Thanks.
Okay, well, we'll now open the public portion of the public meeting and invite comments from members of the public. If you have not already submitted a card, and we don't have any yet, as far as I know. Oh, we do. I'm sorry. This is my blind spot. Mr. Fego.
Good evening, Commissioners. Thank you for the time and effort you've put in for a long time, repeatedly, to help us get this resolved. Truly appreciate it, and for the staff working diligently as well. I do have a question on the table 1-2, accessory dwelling unit setback requirements. On the side, including the street side, the setback for new attached ADU within the existing space of a primary dwelling or accessory structure, it says for the rear and side, it simply says under the new is sufficient for fire and safety. What is the definition of sufficient? Is it 4 feet, or is it 11 feet, as is the guidance on emergency evacuation requirements for roadways, pathways? So can you provide more specificity to that requirement? Thank you.
Staff, I would appreciate a response from Mr. Fego.
Sure, thank you. It's sort of an ambiguous term, sufficient for fire and safety. It's directly out of the state law. As I understand it, it has to do with evaluation on a case-by-case basis by the building division and the fire department. And when we're looking at conversion of existing space, we're talking about a building that's already located there, and they're simply converting it to an ADU that's attached. And that evaluation would take place under the building permit.
And to phrase it in an additional way, it's really just saying that an ADU within the existing building would only be allowed to locate in a portion of the building that is safe for fire, right? That it isn't so close to a property line that cause a concern for the fire department. But as we just stated, it isn't new construction. For the new construction addition onto an existing house, there are specific setbacks.
Okay. Commissioner Hanson.
I'm surprised that the state law would let us do that, because it sounds like maybe I don't know the process, but it sounds like that's a step that, it's not a rubber stamp thing. It's someone who would have to look at it and make a determination and come out and see it. We're allowed to, and you said it was in the state law, but it seems inconsistent with trying to not have any barriers to that, especially when it's the existing structure anyways.
Thank you. I think it recognizes opportunity in the already built environment to create ADUs. And under the review of a building permit, the building official and the plan checkers are looking at the residential code, which has provisions in it, as I understand, not being a building official, to allow fire-safe construction, looking at fire specifically, up to the property line. That may mean that windows might need to be changed under a plan check to be tempered and non-operable if they're too close to a property line, or exterior materials need to be fire rated if they're within 3 feet of a property line. But I think the state's approach, my interpretation, is that it provides additional opportunity to create units in an already constructed building.
Other questions? I don't see any. Oh, I'm sorry, we need a card, please. Okay, so we'll call Mr. Breckstrom. Looks like Beckstrom.
Hi.
Thank you.
So thanks for, it's amazing to watch you guys all in process. I know a bunch of the members here, and I'm an architect, and so first I want to just compliment everybody here, because I always tell all my clients that everybody here works like at 150%, and so I tell them they have no idea what it takes to make it all happen. So just so you guys know that, that's what I tell my clients, all of them. So, and I'm always, they're smarter than me, Sean. So I didn't know on the second story window, and it's just a little thing, I don't know if you could net that out a little bit, what that was about in terms of regulations. Maybe I misheard.
Would staff answer that question?
Thank you. I'm assuming that the speaker's talking about the design standards, which I just lost, but I apologize. The design standards require that the windows on a second story be that are located less than 10 feet from rear or side property lines, that they be clear story with the bottom of the glass located at least 6 feet above the finished floor of that second story. So in layperson's term, transom window. That's to limit the view into neighboring yards to the side and the rear. There is an exception in that statement that says, except as necessary for egress purposes as required by the building code, should a bedroom be located on a side property line within 10 feet. A transom window wouldn't allow proper egress, and if that's the only option available to that bedroom given the configuration of the ADU, then a transom window, the town would allow a regular window that meets egress requirements to go into that space.
Thank you. Any other further comment or question?
Yeah, I guess that clarifies it, and I think especially the part about the egress, and then it's probably just I appreciate and understand it, and I think the challenge in our, I'm not going to argue it or support, but as an architect and then as somebody that's worked in Europe and history and so forth, is that what can happen on some houses, and they just look like they have bullet windows on the second floor. So a house, when it presents itself, is really a face. And a house is either nice and welcomes people. Actually, it signals to people, like a temple tells you to come in. So that's what architecture does. And so the downside, and I'm not arguing with it, but it's a weird thing, because I've worked in a lot of different jurisdictions. It's nothing about Los Gatos, but these second floor windows that are up high in transoms, in a way, it sounds really deep, but it takes away the humanity of the space inside. Because basically, if you go, I live in Los Gatos, just off Loma Alta, all these historic houses, just built a house there, and thanks to everybody helping me there, because it helped me do it. But so that when a window's larger and lower, right, and you're in that space, imagine you're a child, right, and all you see is sky and blue. So when it's a taller window, you actually see your neighbors. So it's this weird, so I'm posing this as a question. I'm not asking for anybody to do anything, but but actually it comes into play in a lot of planning issues. is that then, like I just was walking here from my house, and there's a house that just has a bunch of little transom windows on the second floor because it was done 10 years ago. A house next door that's 1890s has tall, actually 7-foot tall double hung windows. They're huge, right? But nobody thinks about that, and they're cute. And if there's a child, I would draw that house with the tall windows, and we'd recognize it as a house. If I was a child and I drew the house with the little windows, somebody would go, why do they have such small windows? It's almost like little peekaboo windows. So it actually is I hate to say, it's almost like a big deal, because all the houses that I've worked on for years, people come in and they go, it has big windows, not modern, let's say, but it feels like you can see outside and so forth. So it's a real, sorry, Jen, it's like why people moved to Los Gatos. I'll end it on this. We all moved to Los Gatos. There's a village. I go to a cafe. I want to sit right next to people. I don't sit 100 feet away. I sit in Zona Rosa, and there's people all around. So it's this weird. So I'm just saying that's the.
Your time is up.
Thank you. So thanks for
But
listening.
let's see if there are any questions from
sure.
my fellow
Thank you.
commissioners. I don't see any. Thanks so much. And we have a card from Mr. Kanal, and forgive me if I messed up your name.
No, that's correct, Kanal. Pradeep Kanal. So I'm one of the residents of Los Gatos, 1.5 years in the town. So I'm potentially considering ADU in future. I have a detached garage, that 1.5 floor. So I haven't done much research on what the regulations and rules are. So on a very high level, just I wanted to understand the new changes, the state changes. Has it made the process more strict or kind of relaxed, or what do I expect in terms of, from what I heard when I moved into Los Gatos was that the town was kind of promoting, encouraging ADUs as much as possible. Is that still the sentiment, or has that changed, or what is the implication on a high level? Thank you.
Stand by. Questions from commissioners? I don't see any. Would staff respond to his question?
Sure. Thank you for the question. I think the general motive or momentum behind the state is to make ADUs easier and easier to create. I think our ordinance, while it's getting longer in content, captures all the requirements of the state law and goes beyond the state law to make creation of ADUs easier. It removes barriers to creation.
And I would also add that over the last year, the town has continued to work in compliance with state law to simplify the process. So at the beginning of this year, the process that was required for a new accessory dwelling unit was changed so that it no longer requires a separate accessory dwelling unit permit from the planning department prior to the building department. And so now there is one form that is filled out for a new ADU that provides the information that's needed for planning and building and the request for the new address for the ADU all at once to simplify, streamline, and reduce the fees that are required for those ADU processes.
Thank you. Appreciate your coming today. I want to see if there's questions for you from commissioners. I didn't see a hand before, but Commissioner Thomas?
I don't have a question for the speaker, but thank you for coming tonight and submitting public comment. But I did have a follow-up question for staff, and that was about, I know that part of this is related to aligning with state laws and some of our implementation programs associated with the housing element. But I do know that there are some other jurisdictions that have additional incentives, I would say, other than the ordinances. So one of the questions I was going to ask later, but since it has come up, are there other plans for having, ready to go plans online, or some of those other programs that I know some other local cities have?
I can start and then defer to Jennifer. I'm not aware of any plans to have pre-approved plans. Several cities have that, and other cities have some requirement or some allowances that the town has not explored at this point. But if there are ideas that the Planning Commission has to remove barriers or allow different product types with the ADUs, that could be part of your recommendation to the council.
And what I would add on that subject is that Santa Clara County, there are a number of different regional agencies, groups of the different planning departments who do connect, and There is a planning collaborative that's been developing a handbook and website that helps step residents through the process. They've actually just published that in the last month, and so that is now available online. It has information. It's a little bit broader than specifically to Los Gatos's regulations and processes, but there are a number of resources like that, and they are working to have some designs kind of pre-designed. It wouldn't be pre-approved because each of our sites has its own specific situation and consistency in design with the main house is required, but they are working to provide some of those kind of pre-designed items for ADUs to try and simplify and shorten and lessen the expense for those processes. So even if that's not being done here in Los Gatos, the regional groups are working on providing that.
Commissioner Hanson.
Thank you for that question, Commissioner Thomas. I wanted to follow up. I think we asked this when we were discussing the housing element because we have a certain number of units that are contributing to our RENA that we expect to have. And so when we were having these discussions, we were like, let's make sure that we're encouraging and educating people on how to do ADUs so that it's easy for them. And so those kinds of resources, are we putting those links on our town website, so that people can, that like our recent speaker could say, oh gosh, they really do want us to do ADUs and I don't know what to do, but here, I can just click on this and get help.
Yeah, thank you. We do have an ADU website or a page on our website. With this particular example that I was giving of information on the regional level, we're taking a look at that to make sure that it is consistent with our processes before we post it and link it from our website, but that is something that we're considering. In addition to that, in terms of making it easier for ADUs to be built, our town attorney just reminded me that the town doesn't actually charge a transportation impact fee for ADUs, even if they are over the 750 square feet, where the state would allow us to charge at least a partial impact fee for transportation. So there are those elements as well where the impact fees, for example, are reduced.
Thank you.
Do we have any speakers on Zoom, Mr. Paulson?
Thank you, Chair. No, I don't see any hands raised on Zoom for this item.
Thank you. So we'll now close the public portion of the public hearing on item 3 and ask if commissioners have any remaining questions for staff, wish to comment on the proposed recommendation, or introduce a motion regarding the recommendation for consideration by council. Commissioner Thomas.
I do have a question about the parking minimum because I know that was just carried over from our previous ordinance or our current ordinance, and I was just wondering if that was just carried over because it doesn't conflict with any state laws, or if it was looked at with regards to reducing that, because I know that is on the list of one of the things that can really help with eliminating some of the barriers.
Thank you for that question. It was evaluated to make sure that it was aligning with state law, and there was one minor change made to it. We moved a sentence out of the introductory paragraph down into the lettered list. Otherwise, we didn't make any other changes because it did align with the state law.
Okay. So I think that when I was looking at this, I mean, I know staff, you worked really hard and you did a really great job, and I really appreciate how thorough it was. I feel like that is something that's really, there's usually not many people living in these ADUs, and there already are a lot of exceptions for the parking minimum, and I think that it would be something that the town could easily commit to reducing, especially with all the work that we're planning on doing. So I'm just interested to hear what the other commissioners think about that, especially because I think in this area, a lot of the ADU use we're hoping is going to be people that are, retiring, downsizing, moving back in with families, young children. And I just am really curious what my fellow commissioners have to say about it. This feels like low-hanging fruit to me.
Is there any comment at this time by commissioners? Commissioner Janoff.
Just a question, if you could point to the specific change that you are recommending.
Just getting rid of having a parking minimum. Just eliminating it. I mean, unless there's something specific that I know that in some jurisdictions, if the garage is being turned into an ADU and then that parking is also eliminated, sometimes there's some substitution that is needed. But other than that, just eliminating any restrictions associated with it.
Through the chair, I can add some clarification relative to that specific scenario before I lose it off my mind. When you eliminate, per state law and the draft ordinance, if you eliminate a garage or convert it to an ADU, you do not have to replace the parking. And that is included in our ordinance. That's actually the one sentence I think we moved. And if the Planning Commission wanted to make the recommendation to eliminate the parking requirement, that would continue, in my read, to align with state law, because the state law is providing the minimums that you need to allow. And if we went a step further to be more permissible, it's my understanding that that would be consistent with state law.
Thank you. Commissioner Hanson.
I actually think it's a good idea to be more lenient on parking for this than the state law requires to encourage the production of ADUs.
And through the chair, before it slips my mind again, I'd say in a majority of the ADUs that we process, they would meet one of these exemptions. And so parking's not something that we tend to have a lot of conversations about. When we get up into the hillsides, you're far away from usually it's the transit exemption that gets triggered. You're far away from transit, and most of those properties, not all, but most of those properties tend to be able to accommodate the additional parking space that's required. But it's not my experience is it's not a conversation we have very often, that people are having a hardship meeting the parking when it is required. I just wanted to offer that.
Thank you. Commissioner Janoff.
Well, and it could be that people can't meet it, so they're not having the conversation. So, we don't really know, but it sounds, to me, it's one of those situations where if it isn't a problem to reduce it, then why not do that? And that further underscores the town's desire to increase housing. It's just one of those sort of things that we can add to the housing element. So I would be in favor of doing that. We've talked about reducing parking requirements in a number of ways. This seems consistent with that line of thinking. So I appreciate the comment and would support that.
Thank you. And I just, for the public's knowledge, want to confirm that the amendments were drafted by staff but have been reviewed by town council.
By through clarification, by the town attorney.
By the town attorney,
Yes.
excuse me, misspoke.
Yes, that's accurate.
Okay, thank you for that. So I think we're ready for a motion, if someone would want to.
Sorry, I have one more question. I have another. Can I ask something else? I did also just have a question. I got real into the ADUs. So, I did have another question about any density bonuses associated with ADUs, because I know that there are some jurisdictions that have also done some things like that. Did we look at, again, these are going above and beyond some of the state laws, obviously. But I know that it's like a density bonus for multiple ADUs, which allows for construction of one unrestricted ADU for every affordable ADU deed restricted one, which I know that the city of San Diego adopted it, but
Yeah, so through the
okay,
chair. Yeah,
thank you.
We don't, first of all, we don't count ADUs as density. We don't have anything that goes to the extreme that the city of San Diego has gone through. That is one opportunity that they chose to go with so that they could encourage actual deed restricted affordable ADUs. Virtually none of our ADUs are deed restricted, but that is one of the ways that folks could encourage those deed restricted ADUs, which are truly affordable. But ultimately, I think San Diego's in a little different scenario than we are, especially when it comes to transit and many other topics. But there currently isn't anything that goes as far as, say, the city of San Diego.
Thank you. So there's no really other incentives that we could do to help with in affordability.
There are, and there actually is in the ordinance currently. We
Yeah.
haven't finished it yet, which is the potential for using below market price fees for, I think we say, for potentially building permit or a portion of building permit fees.
Okay.
But that program hasn't been fleshed out yet.
Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Jenoff.
I just wanted to reflect that at the rate that this ordinance continues to evolve, given that state law is continuing to evolve as we go forward into this sixth cycle of the housing element and see opportunities for change or further incentives, we can always observe and make those recommendations at a later point. So, I mean, we may want to learn many more things from other jurisdictions, but I don't feel compelled to try to put them all in here tonight. But I think these are good ideas to continue to keep a look at.
Commissioner Hanson.
I just wanted to comment that I appreciate the suggestion from Commissioner Thomas to come up with ideas and look at what other people are doing to do that. I think it might be a little premature for that, and I concur with Commissioner Janoff's comment that the ADU laws are continuing to evolve, and more things will come down from the state. And I don't know that that would be the thing that would encourage people to do deed restricted ADUs. I'm sure I haven't had those conversations directly with people, but I'm sure what is going on is that having a deed restricted ADU, if they decide to sell their home, is a liability to someone that was buying the home, and they would have to look at that. So I'm not sure that would be the thing that would fix it, and I think it would need to be studied. So I think we're good with what we have with the change in the parking.
Yeah, I see a growing consensus. Commissioner Thomas.
Okay, I just want to add one more thing. Thank you, Chair. I agree. I think that it was interesting to see the different ways that some other jurisdictions have tried to get them. I mean, obviously, our ADUs can't be sold separately, so I don't even know how the city of San Diego is doing these kinds of things. But it was interesting because there are some other places that have been able to make them affordable rentals, which I think that if those things come up in the future, we should just keep an eye on, which is why I wanted to bring it up. I agree that it's very far ahead to try and get it in here. And I also noticed that the San Mateo County is working with a third party that basically provides support to applicants, and it seemed like a very cool project that was like very low risk and impact to the county and Redwood City. It was like Redwood City, San Mateo County, and it was some places up there. And that organization looked like they were doing a lot of helpful work. So if they reach out to us, it would be great to partner with them. But it sounds like something like that is in the pipeline for Santa Clara County, which would be great.
There are discussions about that and other similar potential programs.
Other questions? Since Commissioner Thomas brought up the issue about separate sale, can you comment on that, Mr. Millen?
Sure, thank you for that. So the state law currently prohibits separate sale of an ADU, and I'm going to make a distinction between ADU and JDU. So separate sale of an ADU is prohibited unless it meets these very narrow criteria for being created by a nonprofit housing group and sold to a qualified buyer, which is defined by income. So there's a very small carve-out exception to allow sale of an ADU separate from the house. Relative to junior accessory dwelling units, which remember are physically attached to the single family residence, they are prohibited from sale and a deed restriction is required to be recorded that prohibits the sale among some other characteristics that need to be adhered to.
Thank you for that clarification. I think we're ready for a motion. Commissioner Jenna.
Yes, I would propose a motion, and per staff, I'm looking at the recommendation on page 10 of the staff report, and that is what I'm going to turn into a recommendation with your with your concurrence. So my recommendation is that we recommend to Town Council approval of the amendments to Chapter 29 of the Town Code and the draft ordinance amendments, Exhibit 2, to the staff report. The Planning Commission can make the findings numbers 1 and 2 of the staff report on the same page, and we would recommend that parking be eliminated from the ADU ordinance, and the motion would incorporate Table 1-2 accessory dwelling unit setback requirements as provided in the Item 3 addendum.
Thank you for that. Do we have a second? Commissioner Henson?
I second the motion.
Any discussion? I don't see any. So we'll have a raise of hands for those who support the motion. And that's unanimous. Thank you very much. And no appeal rights on this one, either.
That is correct, because it's a recommendation to Town Council. There is no appeal.
And so we have no other business to discuss on that item on the agenda. And so we'll have a report from the planning manager.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask a general question before we move on to the next agenda item, and that has to do with the once these zoning changes are approved by Town Council, that establishes those as the current code. And so when and if we were to receive applications for builder's remedy or some such after the time that those changes were approved, then those would be the ordinance or zoning requirements that those applications would need to adhere to.
That is correct.
So we're interested in seeing this process happen with good speed, because we're based on the information we received last night, which was really interesting to me regarding why developers would invoke the builder's remedy, would be to develop under the density numbers that we would recommend for meeting our RENA. And so having these density or these zoning changes helps establish that we have a floor below which developers wouldn't be able to propose. Is that correct?
I would clarify that we would expect there may be additional claims for builder's remedy until the time when the housing element is certified by the state, as we discussed last night. But yes, the goal would be to get the new rules in place with the higher densities so that future development would be evaluated based on those new regulations.
Okay. Great, thank you.
And the town attorney?
Yeah, like two things to add. And so it's a housing overlay zone. And so I think the underlying zoning remains in effect. The applicant can choose between the underlying zoning and the overlay.
My understanding, and we can get more clarification as we're moving forward with that, because this is a question that's come up. But it seems clear that we need to have that higher density, that HCD is looking for that to be the rule that's in place. But I think it's good to have that question so that we can make sure we have that clarification for Town Council. And then
the other thing is, just wanted to say that the ordinance would be introduced and then adopted, and then it would take effect 30 days after adoption.
Anything else under other business? If not, we'll go to the report from the planning manager.
Thank you. Just a few things coming up to report on. We do have a town council meeting scheduled for next Tuesday, the 19th, and that will include a number of different discussions, including the appeal of the Planning Commission's approval of the Winchester Assisted Living Project that will be under consideration next week. Also, a further discussion of the housing element work plan is also scheduled for that. The staff report for next week's meeting items will be available at the end of the day Thursday or early Friday of this week. In addition, we do have a special Housing Element Advisory Board meeting scheduled for the 28th of September, and that we do expect to have a revised version of the housing element for consideration at that time.
Thank you. Any questions from the commissioners based on that report? Thank you. And now we'll move on to subcommittee reports. In addition to their service on the Planning Commission, members of the commission serve on several town committees and commissions. One is the Conceptual Development Advisory Commission, which I am chair of, and there's no report for tonight. And it's the report from the Housing Element Advisory Board. Commissioner Henson.
Yes, the Housing Element Advisory Board had a meeting on August 24th, and what we've been doing is having meetings once a month for the past several months to continue the progress to try and get the housing element certified. That meeting was just a check-in meeting because staff has hired a new consultant. The new consultant has a lot of experience getting housing elements over the finish line, which has been a problem for many, many jurisdictions in California. And there was a meeting, as I understand it, on September 5th. And so what was expected is that we would see the draft at the September meeting, as mentioned by staff, but we weren't doing that at that last meeting. We just looked at some of the things that had been happening, and their progress was being made.
Thank you. And do we have a report from Historic Preservation Committee, Commissioner Burnett?
There's nothing to report.
Okay, very good. Well, as always, we thank staff for their very hard work and excellent staff report. My fellow commissioners for their time in preparing and being here tonight, and to all the members of the public who spoke and attended this evening. I'll call the meeting adjourned.